So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we acquire range of motion and why stretching may fail in many cases. It doesn't mean that stretching is useless. It doesn't mean that there's never a time and a place for it. It just means that the way it's applied may actually influence whether you have a favorable outcome or not. So we're going to use a simple representation of a synovial joint. So this could be any synovial joint that we're talking about that has muscles on either side. We're also going to use a pretty simplified model that doesn't really exist. And so we're going to fall back on the old school antagonist-agonist relationship around a joint because it is a simple representation, even though it probably doesn't really exist. But again, it'll give us a clear enough picture that we can create some understanding. So I drew some joints up here on the board, and so this first one is going to be our simple representation of a synovial joint at rest. And so I have musculature on the outside in red, I have synovium in purple, and then I've got the synovial fluid inside the joint in blue. And so at rest, we're going to make an assumption that there's some sort of evenness in regards to concentric to eccentric orientation on either side. So we're in some middle range of the musculature, and so the pressure inside the joint is relatively even, and so we have this resting position of the joint. If I was to increase the concentric orientation on both sides, so I take an agonist and an antagonist, and I increase concentric orientation of both of those muscles, what I get is a compressive strategy. So I'm pulling the two bones together, the synovial fluid gets pushed out of the joint equally in both directions. And so what I have is concentric on concentric. This actually creates a very stable position of a joint, but it doesn't allow motion to occur. So this actually may occur in someone that has a very, very strong training experience in the gym. So they lift heavy weights, they carry a lot of muscle mass, or they perform at high rates of speed or high forces. And so they use a lot of concentric on concentric muscle activity to create stability in a joint. So we could have that scenario going on. Under normal circumstances, for normal movement, what we actually have to do is create a gradient across the joint. So we'll have one side of the joint that has a high pressure strategy, which would be concentric, and on the other side we have a lower pressure strategy, which would be eccentric. And this is what allows movement to occur under most situations. And so as long as we can create this scenario, this is what allows us to recapture range of motion, because the people that come in with restrictions tend to have some sort of concentric bias or a compressive strategy or an exhalation strategy that actually prevents motion from occurring. And so I could have the same thing here, where on one side of the joint I would be biased towards concentric orientation, and then on the other side I would be biased towards eccentric orientation. And what that may allow is a lot of motion in one direction, but not a lot of motion in the other direction. So for instance, if I am biased towards an inhalation strategy, I may show a lot of external rotation in my joints and not very much internal rotation, or vice versa if I am in an exhaled strategy. So again, this can represent my ability to move through space under normal circumstances if I can create concentric here, eccentric here, or it may represent a strategy that limits my motion in one direction. Now, if we were to apply a stretch that fails, so viscoelastic properties of tissues aside, so we have viscoelastic tissues that may show a temporary change in the ability to acquire range of motion just because of the property of the tissues. But what we're talking about here is the contractile element in regard to the muscles. If I take a concentric on concentric situation and I pull on one side, I may actually create a small enough gradient to acquire temporary small changes in range of motion. But ultimately what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a strain on one side of the joint as I try to acquire an eccentric orientation where I have a muscle that is trying to stay concentrically oriented. And so under these situations, this is where stretching is going to fail. So maybe you get an increase in stretch tolerance, maybe you get a temporary change in viscoelastic properties of tissues, but ultimately this is why stretching is going to fail. So what happens when stretching does work? So say for instance, say I'm doing a long seated toe touch, and I do it over time, and eventually I find that my flexibility improves where I can actually take my forehead to my knees and I say, wow, my hamstrings really increased in their length. That's not really happening. What you're actually doing is you're actually creating this scenario in a favorable way, where you're actually able to capture a gradient that allows greater motion to occur at the hip joint, which might allow you to bend forward more, or you're allowing the posterior aspect of the thorax and pelvis to expand to capture its inhalation capabilities, and then I again capture a gradient that allows me to move better. So the bottom line of this entire situation is, for normal movement to occur or for your ability to recapture ranges of motion, you have to be able to create a gradient inside the joint or inside the space. So inside the space would be inside the thorax, inside the joint would be inside any synovial joint. If I cannot move the fluid from side to side across the joint, I cannot recapture range of motion. That's why using breathing and position and trying to acquire concentric orientation of eccentric musculature and in trying to capture eccentric orientation of concentric musculature is so important in reacquiring range of motion, because I have to have this scenario. I have to have a gradient that exists to allow movement to occur.